The incarnation of Christ is something we hear a lot about, that it is made up, and that Christians just have it as a story in their back pocket that they pull out at Christmas time.
So was the incarnation stolen from other cultures, from other mythologies? And if the incarnation is real, if Jesus Christ did become man, God became man, what does that mean for us?
Hi, I'm Stacey McLaren.
I'm John Beeson.
And this is God in the Gray, a place where we talk about spirituality, religion, and all of the gray areas that we find God in. We consider this a conversation at a table as if we are all sharing a good meal. And we encourage you to leave questions, reach out to us with comments, anything you would like to engage with us. Again, it is a conversation, and we invite you to join us. We are real people at a real church in Tucson, Arizona, and it is our pleasure to invite you along with this conversation. So the incarnation, here we are, it's December, it's Christmas time. We are getting ready to look at Christ's birth, which comes from, he is fully God and incarnated and born of a Virgin Mary. But we hear that this is a made-up story or a borrowed story, and that Christians just pull it out to, say that we're the only religion that believes this. But is that really the case?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let's start with that word, incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
Incarnation means in flesh. And specifically, it's the idea of God becoming flesh. And so there are charges that, hey, listen, you can look kind of across the world and find other stories that seem to look a little bit like this story of Jesus, God becoming flesh. And so let's deal with a few of those kind of on their face. Let's turn over and begin here with Zoroaster. Zoroaster. Zoroaster was born of a virgin in an immaculate conception by a ray of divine reason. So Zoroastrianism predates Christianity. You could look at that story and say, oh, wait a second, so this other religious figure has a similar story of Jesus, predates Jesus, and so what do you do with that? Let me take us to another one. Horus was the Egyptian god who was born of a virgin, Isis. He was the only begotten son of the god Osiris. And so this is, if you picture this is like the Egyptian falcon god, oftentimes depicted with a falcon head. And you have mural and textual evidence from Egypt indicates Isis hovered over the genitals of Osiris, the god of fertility, to conceive Horus. So that's a second story. A third story is Dionysus, Roman god. One account has him born of a virgin, and I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce his mom's name, Semele, Semele. And multiple tellings of his origins all connect to Zeus being the god who created him. And so you have three accounts here. You'll share two others, and then we'll kind of come back and process a few of these. But those are three you could say, incarnational accounts of God's becoming human beings.
Yeah. So we have Romulus, who was born of a Vestal virgin. So it would be a priestess of the goddess Vesta, and she was a hearth god, so of fire, a goddess of fire. So she actually, Romulus's mother, a priestess under Vesta, claimed that she was impregnated by the god Mars, and thus became Romulus, and that she was a virgin as well. Then you have Krishna, who I'm sure we've all heard of, I'm going to get these names right. So according to Bhagavata Purana, some believe that Krishna was born actually without sexual union, so no intercourse between his parents, but a mental transmission of thought that impregnated his mother from the mind of Vasudeva into the womb of Devaki, his mother. Now, similarities here just in language is that Krishna and Christ were both considered God by the people of the time, the Son of God and God. They were both sent from heaven and both came in the form of man. So one in the 3rd century, one in the 9th century.
So just to go back to the Krishna one. So and let me kind of circle back to some of those because they're interesting and they kind of have to be taken on their own accounts. And I'll start with the Krishna one's interesting because and I just like we would encourage you to kind of do your own digging in these things. Some of these things are actually pretty new to me. And so I'm kind of fresh in some of this territory. And so I encourage you to kind of dig in and kind of figure out the historical sources because there's a lot. Man, if you start on the surface here, you're going to find a lot of accounts that are actually, there's really no historic support. Then you find other accounts. Krishna is an interesting example because the accounts of Krishna appear to go back, the earliest would be the 3rd century AD. The latest would be the 9th century. So notice that that's like hundreds of years after Christ's birth, you have the Krishna stories emerging. Others of these stories appear before Christ, but they're all kind of different, okay? So even like, let's take, for instance, Romulus or Dionysus is interesting because they have multiple accounts of these gods, as do, actually, if you go back to Horus as well, the Egyptian god, various different accounts of those. And sometimes you have actually just blatant fabrications. The Horus account is an interesting one because you have a lot of blatant fabrications in the contemporizing of that account, kind of to make it look as though it's more like Christ's birth than it really actually was in the true stories that are being told. Oftentimes these are tricky because a lot of them are oral accounts. And so you're trying to track oral history and trying to figure out, well, where did this emerge and at what point? And so it's just kind of squishy in terms of what those are. And I'll just pull back and say a couple things about all of these accounts. First of all, let's remember that what's important about the Christian idea of the incarnation is not that it's original. Whether or not you judge Jesus Christ to truly be the Son of God incarnate in flesh or not, what's important about it isn't that, oh, there is this brand new original idea. The question or not is whether or not it's true. Did Jesus Christ, is he actually God made flesh? And so, and that's true for all of these, right? Because if any of those are true, well then, goodness, like that changes the game significantly. And so I would just encourage you to look back on those. Of these accounts, really the only actual historic figure is Zoroaster. And so that's maybe, perhaps you could argue, the most significant of these, because all of the other ones are religious or mythological characters. And so they're not actual human beings who kind of lived that we can track their life. There's not historic accounts of these. These are tales that are told. And so I would just say that's actually a significant difference, right? Yeah. Because Jesus Christ, we have significant historic attestation of his existence, not just from the tellers of the speakers of history found in the Bible, but also those, you have accounts of his existence outside of scriptures and by non-believers, very important in terms of determining the accuracy of whether or not this person lived. So to recount, what is important about the incarnation? It's not the idea, it's just whether or not it's true.
Right.
And then if it's true, actually what's significant about the Christian account is actually very different than the Egyptian, Roman, or Hindu accounts. Because in those three traditions, you have accounts of very, very earthy accounts. You follow stories of the god Horus or Dionysus or Romulus. They're very earthy, fleshy, oftentimes kind of like raise your eyebrow kind of characters in
Right.
terms of what they're doing, and it's kind of questionable kind of stuff. In other words, you could argue that they're more earthly than they are divine.
Right.
And so the shocking piece of the story of Jesus Christ is not necessarily the story of incarnation. It's fact that the story of an incarnate God came out of a Jewish tradition. And that is shocking because unlike anything at the time, the Jewish tradition is not polytheistic. It's monotheistic. Right. There's a transcendent God, a God who is above and other. And the fact that out of this tradition, there comes an account of God becoming flesh. And this isn't just a mythological account. It's an actual person rooted in history that we can say, oh, this man, Jesus of Nazareth, we can locate him. This person is supposed to be God in flesh. Now that changes the game.
Yeah. I think that's so good, that the transcendent God comes near, comes to be with us. And we can read that, we can see it in Hebrews. It even says in Hebrews 4, we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet is without sin. Like, there is nothing that we have gone through or that we will go through that Jesus did not experience in some form or fashion. And yet he was fully God and became fully man. He did not keep himself removed. He entered in, like you said, through a Jewish girl and became human for us. And like that should be eyebrow raising in a whole different way, right? It is awe-inspiring. It brings you, if you will allow him to work in your heart, it brings you to your knees in humility to think that the God, the creator of all, came to be with us. That's huge.
Yeah. And so different. Like the outcome of that is so different than any of these other figures. Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's start with Zoroaster, where you have a very, very much kind of, you even hear that language in the incarnational story. It's a divine light, a divine ray. And so very much a religion that's very much focused on the mental understanding, mental enlightenment, right? You have the other stories where there's not really redemption at all that comes through any of the incarnational characters and any of the other religious figures. It's a story of, oh, the gods are just like me. The gods are just like us. They're us kind of on steroids, if you will, right? There's not hope of redemption in that story. But you hear in the telling of Hebrews this profound hope that if it's true that the Son of God became flesh, what it means is that we can reach out to a God who empathizes with us. This is not deism, this is theism. This is a God who has compassion, who cares, and who doesn't just, it's not just this mental impact, it's an embodied impact. Oh, it's not a surprise that Christianity is really one of the only religions in the world that believes in a bodily resurrection. Now, you could argue that there's ideas of reincarnation that have bodily resurrection, and yet that's not resurrection. It's just a restatement of the being, not a transformation still in bodily fashion. That's radical. And let me circle back a little bit to the historical evidence too. Here's what's really cool. Okay, so let me take us to Philippians 2. Philippians 2 is one of Paul's earliest letters. And so this is written within a few decades after Jesus' death. And what's interesting in Philippians 2 is that you have an attestation of the incarnation in what's called a Christ hymn, which predates that pretty scholars agree that this hymn predates it significantly. And so if you go over to Philippians 2, and I encourage you to kind of read this on your own, there's this amazing little statement. Let me read just a part of it, right? Have this mind among yourselves, which is in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And it goes on from there, speaking then of the ways in which that then, that actually inspires worship. That God becomes flesh actually inspires worship of this God who loves us so much that he responded to us by serving us. And that's the power of Christmas. That's the power of the Christian story of the incarnation, is that it draws us into worship with a God who has drawn near to us.
It's so good. Such a great reminder of Jesus is the reason for the season. It sounds so trite, but it is true. Like his incarnation is why we celebrate Christmas. It's why we have the faith that we have in a God who came near. We are so thankful that you joined us in this episode. Again, we do want your questions and your comments. You can drop them down below. We encourage you to hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. Once again, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.